Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to look at the new Unearthed Arcana for the Psion class, a new possible class. I know we had the Mystic way back when. That's kind of like a different version of this, but then again, the Mystic was also just based basically off the old Psion, so it's kind of just taken a few different shapes throughout the history of D&D, or at least throughout the history of 5e at least. You know, hopefully, fingers crossed, it's something we actually get this time because the Mystic got dumped way back then and they just haven't touched it since. I haven't even taken the time to look at the full UA yet. I've just looked at the base class, the spell list, the spells. We'll take a look at all those and more. And while this is a little similar to the Mystic from way back when, I did look at the old UA for it. And while it is sort of similar, it's not similar enough that I think it's important to make direct comparison. So I won't be really touching on that, except maybe a couple mentions of it early on. So we're really just taking a look at the base class. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into it because we got quite a bit to go through. So starting first with the Psion Summary, it says that they are a master of psionic power, no surprises there. Psions weave magic and extraordinary powers through the power of their minds. They develop their minds as fonts of power that manifest spells and grow stronger over the course of their adventuring careers. Then of course you can find everything you need to play one of these psionic powerhouses in the next few sections. I imagine that they're probably going to change that last sentence in whatever it's published in. Usually they don't say you can find more information below in the sort of flavor text of a class. And then additionally there were some developer notes. It says, what is a Psion? Psions are spellcasters who use innate mental powers to gain extraordinary abilities and unleash the magic of their minds. Psions and their magic, sometimes called psionics, can trace their history back to the appendix of the first edition Player's Handbook, and a psionics using class first appeared in the Complete Psionics Handbook in 1991. Psionics have taken numerous forms in D&D, from an alternative magic systems to options that dovetail into other D&D rules. In the 5th edition, psychic power is synonymous with magic, and the magic of the mind flavors numerous spells, monsters, and subclasses, such as the Psi Warrior Fighter and the Aberrant Sorcery Sorcerer in the Player's Handbook. In this edition, the Psion is a spellcaster who interfaces with magic and spellcasting similarly to other classes in the game. This UA provides the Psion with unique twists on spellcasting using psionic energy die and the psionic spellcasting feature, carving out a space to make the Psion stand out from its other spellcasting peers. I know, again, I haven't really read any other opinions on this. I've just kind of seen notifications that pop up from subreddits, but I haven't actually gone into any of those threads. But I know one of the first complaints that I saw when this dropped was that they were complaining that Wizards of the Coast seems to want to refuse to separate psionics from spellcasting. And while I understand sort of the desire to want a fully unique psionics system, I think it's a little too late for that, unfortunately. I do think it makes more sense within the framework of 5th edition to tie it to spellcasting. If they had not already re-released the Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, the Soul Knife Rogue, and the Psi Warrior Fighter, then I would say maybe they can kind of just rework the whole psionic system and then re-release all those subclasses along with it. But since those have already been released under the new 2024 rules, they can't really make a whole psionic system that just works for this one new class and then have to revise those already existing sort of psionic-based subclasses later down the road again within 2024. I mean, it's just unnecessary work that doesn't need to be done. So while I understand the desire for a whole unique psionic system, I just don't think it makes sense within 5e. I think most things that could be expressed as a form of psionic power can also just be expressed through an existing spell or through a new spell that they want to create. This is sort of similar to how the Artificer doesn't technically cast spells. You know, the spells that they cast are sort of designed to be sort of either mishaps of their inventions or the purpose of their inventions to sort of cast these things. It does, they do sort of follow the same rules as spellcasting, but that is sort of the flavor that is on that class. And then I would imagine something very similar to happen to the Psion. And then when I saw that notification with that sort of complaint come up, I think I was in my kitchen making lunch, and I was just okay, I haven't read the UA yet. If I were making a spellcasting Psion for 5e, what would it look like? They would probably maybe have baseline just remove components from some of their spells, whether it just be verbal and or somatic or something along those lines. At least in the old monster manual, that was a very common feature of creatures who had innate spellcasting, which is basically what psionics are, is that they could cast their spells without any components. I don't think that they will remove all components because that would just be imbalanced for a player, but I imagined that they would remove some components. And then similarly, I also thought that maybe possibly that they might limit their spell list to only certain schools of spells, because I was thinking okay, abjuration makes sense, illusion and enchantment makes sense for a Psion. And then I was you know what, basically everything but most evocation spells and necromancy spells can usually be expressed as a psionic power in some way. And then this got me thinking about the old Netherese mages who specifically specialized in 2 schools of magic, and that even excluded them from 2 other schools of magic. I don't think that the Psion is going to work like that, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they used that as a sort of avenue for making the Psion stand out from other classes by having them hyper specialize in very specific schools of magic. That was my initial prediction, so let's go ahead and take a look at the actual traits now and see maybe how close I was. So starting with the core traits, the Psion is of course an intellect user. They do have a D6 hit die, which basically puts them in line with the wizard and the sorcerer. This is one of the few times that I'm going to mention the mystic, because the mystic did have a D8 hit die, so that is sort of a step down from them. But I don't know if this was like an intentional mathematical reason to have a D6 hit die, or if they just wanted to make sure that of all the full casters that exist in the game, we already have 3 D8 based full casters in the bard, the cleric, and the druid. And then when the Psion comes out, we would then have 3 D6 full casters in the sorcerer, the wizard, and the Psion. The intelligence and wisdom saving throws are nice and very similar to, I believe the wizard has the same. No armor is a choice. I think, again, that is a step down from the mystic, who had at least proficiency in light armor. Neither of the other D6 full casters, the sorcerer and the wizard, have any proficiency in armor. I feel like, letting the Psions have proficiency in light armor, it would just be one way to differentiate them from the other casters. In the moment I saw that they had no armor, I was like, okay, they better have the mage armor spell, and they probably should also have the shield spell. So we'll see how that turns out. The starting equipment is what it is. It is in the 2024, sort of framework where you get an equipment package or starting gold. Notably, they do come with 20 crossbow bolts, and that is because they come with a crossbow, but also, even if they didn't come with a crossbow, you would still want those bolts possibly, and we'll take a look at why much later in this video. When you multi-class into a Psion, you only inherit their hit die and no other core traits, such as like any additional skills or anything along those lines. Presumably, this would require an intelligence of 13, since it is their only primary ability. Additionally, you also add your full Psion level when determining your multi-class spellcasting level, which of course makes sense for them as a full caster. So there's no real surprises here. Let's go ahead and get into their actual features, starting with their spellcasting. So first things first, looking at their cantrips. They do start with 2 cantrips. There's many classes that only start with 2 cantrips, and I think most usually get 4 or 5 for some of the other casters, like the sorcerer and the wizard, I believe, get a total of 5 by the end. The description here mentions a new cantrip called Telekinetic Fling, and again, we'll take a look at that closer to the end of the video. Additionally, it says whenever you gain a Psion level, you can replace one of your cantrips from this feature with another Psion cantrip of your choice, very similar to many other casters who can also switch out their cantrips when they gain a level in that class. Additionally, it says when you reach Psions levels 10 and 14, you learn another cantrip of your choice. This is actually a little strange because all the other spellcasters in the game get their additional cantrips at levels 4 and 10. 9 levels is a very long time to wait for an additional cantrip. You will get an additional one at first level in one of our other features that we'll look at in a second. But like the wizard, and I think even the sorcerer, both get 3 cantrips at the start, and they also get their additional cantrips at 4 and 10 as well. I really don't know why they're making the Psion wait so long, so that's one thing that I would probably suggest to adjust. Moving on to the rest of their spellcasting, they do start with 4 Psion level 1 spells prepared. They do end with a total of 22 spells prepared through their actual spellcasting table. Of course, you will get additional spells either through class features or subclass features probably as well. And speaking of that, Psion features that grant spells that are always prepared, of course, don't count against the number of prepared spells that you know. And additionally, they also count as Psion spells like many of the other spellcasters in 2024. Again, I wouldn't expect any of this to really be changing. We're just kind of trying to see how they're set up as a spellcaster. And then of course, whenever you gain a Psion level, you can replace one spell on your spell list with another Psion of a level that you can cast. This is basically identical to Bard spell progression, both in the number of like cantrips that they get and the way that they can manipulate their spells on long rests and on level up, things like that. So if you're used to working with Bard spells, you're very familiar with that as well. Finishing off the spellcasting, of course, intelligence is their spellcasting modifier for their spells. No surprises there. And then finally, we have Psionic spellcasting. This one says when you cast a Psion spell, that spell doesn't require verbal or material components, even if it includes those components in the description, except material components that are consumed by the spell or have a cost specified in the spell. So this is basically taking place of the spell casting focus feature that pretty much every other spellcaster has in the game. So instead of being able to use a spellcasting focus in place of, costly and consumed components, the Psion can basically ignore components that aren't costly or consumed, as well as ignore verbal components of all their spells as well. So this also makes them effectively immune to like the silence spell and other similar effects. And it also means that they don't require a spellcasting focus. They can actually use a spellcasting focus, but they also don't need to use a component pouch to use the material components that aren't costly or consumed. So again, when I was thinking about how a Psionic spellcaster would work, one of my predictions was basically correct. I am a little bit curious about how much material components that have costs and are consumed really matter. Again, we talked about this in one of my more recent videos where I covered somatic and material components and how those are kind of supposed to work. And even though many of us do ignore those rules, many spells that have costly components, such like as many like summoning spells and other spells that just have a cost associated with them, like Identify. Even I think many of us ignore the material component for that spell. I think they could probably make it so that you can ignore material components that even have a cost but aren't consumed, just by curating a spell list of spells that have those kinds of material components but aren't, inherently overpowered if you're able to cast them. And while I know that the game designers will design the game in the way that they intended it to be played and not in the way that the players are actually playing it, I think that is one thing that they possibly could consider in terms of just making the psionic spellcasting that much more flexible, that you would only need the material component for spells that have a consumed component. Moving on to their next level 1 feature, we have a feature called Psionic Power. It says you harbor a wellspring of psionic energy within yourself. The energy is represented by your psionic energy dice. Your psion level determines the die size and the number of psionic energy die you have, as shown in the energy die and number of dice columns of the psion features table. Your psionic energy die are used to enhance or fuel certain psion features. You start with 2 such features, telekinetic propel and telepathic connection, each of which is detailed below. Again, we'll look at those on the next screen. Some of your powers expend psionic energy die as specified in the description. You can't use a power if it requires you to use a die and all of your energy dice are gone. You regain 1 expended psionic energy die when you finish a short rest, and you regain all of them on a long rest. Some features that use a psionic energy die require your target to make a saving throw. That save DC equals the spell save DC from this class's spellcasting feature. So we will start with a total of 4 psionic energy die. This will increase to 6 at level 5, 8 at level 9, 10 at level 13, and 12 at level 7. This basically works out to twice your proficiency bonus. It isn't exactly that per the description, but that's the way that it works out. The die size starts at a D6, so it'll increase to a D8 at level 5, D10 at level 11, and a D12 at level 17. When I first read this, I was like, this sounds a lot like the Battlemaster maneuvers for, of course, the Battlemaster fighter, but they're kind of making it for a spellcaster, so we'll get into all the available uses of these later. But let's go ahead and look at the first 2 psionic powers that are given to us. So we have telekinetic propel. It says, as a bonus action, choose 1 large or smaller creature other than you that you can see within 30 feet of yourself. The target must succeed on a strength saving throw or be pushed or pulled, your choice, up to a number of feet straight away from you equal to 5 times the number rolled. The die is only expended if the target fails the saving throw. Additionally, there's telepathic connection. You have telepathy with a range of 5 feet. As a bonus action, you can expend a psionic energy die and roll it. For a number of minutes equal to your psion level, the range of your telepathy increases by a number of feet equal to 10 times that number. I've made no secrets about how much I love the telekinetic feat, and the telekinetic propel is basically just a more powerful version of that. Even starting at level 1, again, we have a D6 psionic energy die, so we can push or pull someone as few as 5 feet or as much as 30 feet, depending on what that die roll is. And it does have the benefit that the die isn't expended if the target doesn't fail to save, so when you're using this offensively, you do have that sort of efficiency built in. Telepathic connection, again, that's telepathy within 5 feet, which is a pretty short range. It's basically like proximity chat, I guess. You can expend a psionic energy die to increase the range and number of feet by 10 times the result, but also the duration is in minutes equal to your psion level. This sounds a little convoluted to me, and I don't really like this feature a lot. I mean, telepathy is fine. What they're basically doing here with these first couple features is giving you a slightly altered version of the telekinetic feat and the telepathic feat. But, spells like message exist, and that was basically just better than telepathic connection. Eventually you'll get access to Rary's telepathic bond, which is just strictly better than this. This might make it so that you don't feel like you need to prepare those spells, but I feel like this is so inconvenient to use that I would rather just have one of those spells instead, if communicating with people at a distance is something that is important to me. And then, of course, speaking of the telekinetic feat, the next level 1 feature is called Subtle Telekinesis. It says, the Mage Hand cantrip, you can cast it without somatic components, and you can make it invisible when you cast it. This is basically identical to the telekinetic feat. You just don't get the range increase that comes with it. This, of course, gives the Psion a 3rd cantrip at level 1. I still don't think that this is an excuse to give them such late additional cantrips at 10 and 14, because again, there are other classes that also start with 3 cantrips that get them at 4 and 10 as well. So then moving on to our level 2 features, we have Psionic Discipline. It says you learn further psionic techniques that are fueled by your psionic energy die. You gain 2 disciplines of your choice, such as Expanded Awareness or Id Insinuation. Disciplines are described in the Psionic Discipline section later in this class description. Again, we'll look at those later. You can only use 1 discipline each turn and only once per turn unless otherwise noted in those options. Whenever you gain a Psion level, you can replace one of your Psionic Discipline options with one you don't know. You gain 2 more options at level 10 and 2 more at level 17. The level 2 gives us 2 choices right away. These are basically our Battlemaster maneuvers for our Psion. However, the actual rules for them are a little bit more like the meta magic for Sorcerer, in the sense that we can only use 1 per turn unless the description says otherwise, whereas like Battlemaster maneuvers, you can basically kind of spam them. So we start with 2, but we can end with 6 by the end of the game. And then additionally, at level 2, we have a second feature called Psionic Modes. This says you have honed your psionic powers to act as both a shield and a weapon in battle. battle. As a bonus action, you can choose one of the following modes, granting you certain benefits for 1 minute or until you use this feature again. The first one is attack mode. It says damage from your weapon attacks, Psion spells, and Psion features. Ignores resistance to psychic damage. In addition, when you roll damage for a spell, you can expend 1 psionic energy die to re-roll a number of damage dice up to your intelligence modifier minimum of 1, and you must use the new rolls. Defense mode says you have resistance to psychic damage. In addition, when you fail an intelligence, wisdom, or charisma saving throw, you can take a reaction to expend 1 psionic energy die, roll the psionic energy die, and add the number rolled to that saving throw, potentially turning a failure into a success. You can use this feature twice, and you regain all expended uses when you finish a long rest. My first, sort of surface level critique of this feature is that defense mode and attack mode are really corny names. I think that's kind of lame. They could probably come up with something better. Well, I generally think it's a little unfair to directly compare two class features because I think it's a little unfair to not let something stand on its own. This is really just innate sorcery for Psions. This is basically worded the exact same way. You have the same number of charges. It has the same duration. It's the same. They're both bonus actions. The only difference is that this one is modal and you can choose 2 different modes. However, I would argue that innate sorcery is just better because it's useful 100% of the time. It's simpler for sure in the sense that it gives you a +1 to your save DC and then advantage on all of your spell attack rolls, but it's always useful 100% of the time every time that you activate it. Whereas these psionic modes aren't necessarily always guaranteed to be useful. Like if you aren't coming up against a creature with psionic resistance or up against a creature that has psionic damage themselves, half of each of these modes is useless. And while psionic of the sort of elemental damage types is the 4th most common in the new monster manual, you can still go entire adventures without it because, of course, context matters. If you're not in a setting where monsters with psionic damage exist, you're never going to run into it unless your DM specifically puts it there. And then psionic resistance is even less common, again, unless you're in those very specific settings with creatures that are going to have that. But the majority of the time, that's not going to be the case. While I imagine this makes sense with whatever setting that the Psion is going to be released in, I don't think that's a good reason to make a base class feature so specific. If someone showed me this feature and took away the level that is on it, the level 2 on it, and asked me if it was a base class feature or a subclass feature, I would think that this is a subclass feature because it's just a little too specific to be a base class feature. Like, you should be able to play a base Psion in any setting and know that all of their base features at least are going to be useful within that setting. It's really within the subclasses that you can start drilling in and getting more specific. Like the Artificer, I think, is a good example of that. The Artificer, of course, is designed for Eberron. Artificers by nature exist in Eberron. That's why they made a class for them. But if you pick them up and you airdrop them into Forgotten Realms or any other setting, they don't necessarily feel out of place because all their features still work. They aren't really doing anything that someone couldn't be doing in that setting. Whereas this just feels a little out of place as a base class feature. And while I have been comparing their sort of maneuvers to the Battle Master, I really don't want to see a new class that is basically just a Frankenstein of other classes' features. And given that this is basically a copy paste of innate sorcery, I'm just kind of a little disappointed, and I would really like to see this be something else. So all that aside, let's go ahead and move on to their other base class features. Starting at level 3, of course, then you get your Psion subclass. The subclass choices are Metamorph, Psi-Warper, Psykinetic, and Telepath. Again, I have not looked at the Psion subclasses yet, so I'm going to take some guesses right now as to what they are based on just the name alone. I would imagine that the Metamorph is probably focusing on transmutation spells, possibly some abjurations. You might be like turning into certain things. And since my mind was sort of on copycat features when I was reading this would hopefully not just be sort of like a reflavored Blade Singer or Valor Bard. The Psi-Warper, I would imagine, focuses on conjuration spells. Possibly we would see another summon-focused subclass, and or it has features that work like Misty Steps and Vortex Warps and like scatter spells and those kinds of cool things. Psykinetic is for sure a blaster of some kind, and then Telepath is kind of hard to gauge, but I imagine it maybe focuses on a lot of illusion and divination and probably even enchantment spells like your Modify Memories, Detect Thoughts, Locate Creatures, that sort of thing. Connecting your mind to someone else's mind to do something. So those are my predictions. Again, I still haven't looked at the subclasses even as the recording of this video, so we'll have to wait and see how accurate I am again a little bit later, or I imagine many of you might let me know in the comments. Moving on to level 4, of course, you get your first ability score improvement. Again, this is very regular ability score progression. They get no extra feats like the rogue or the fighter. Level 5, they have Psionic Restoration. It says when you finish a short rest, you can regain 1 expended psionic energy die, but no more than a number equal to half your number of dice rounded down. Once you use this feature, you can't do so again until you finish a long rest. I do worry a little if this is going to be enough enough recovery for the Psion. This is basically the only sort of efficiency feature that they get, whereas many classes and subclasses that have these sort of important features have other ways to get them back later on. Like the Bard, for example, has that superior bardic inspiration. The Battlemaster Fighter has the one where they're allowed to just roll a d8 instead of their actual superiority die once per turn. Even the Sorcerer Capstone has some efficiency where, like, during innate sorcery you can always use one meta magic without expending the sorcery points for it, something along those lines. The Psion has nothing like that. Again, some of their features don't require you to expend the die if the creature doesn't fail to save, but there aren't a lot of those, and I worry that we're going to use them too quickly. You know, this would certainly require some actual playtesting, but that is one concern I have with this feature. Moving on then to level 7, we have a feature called Psionic Surge. It says when you roll initiative, you can expend one use of your hit point dice and regain one expended use of your psionic modes. That was like the attack mode and defense mode feature, the innate sorcery for Psions. In addition, after you roll one or more psionic energy dice, you can expend one of your hit point dice and treat any roll of 1, 2, or 3 on those psionic energy dice as a 4. I know alternate uses of hit dice is something that players have been talking about for a long time. I know, like, in the discussions that have existed for a long time in 5e, that sorcerers should be a constitution caster. That I was like, they shouldn't be constitution casters, but they could use their hit die as an alternate resource, and that sort of accomplishes the same thing, but it looks like they're giving that to the Psion instead. So you can either use it to restore one of your expended uses of your psionic modes, or you can expend a hit die to adjust a low roll on your psionic energy die. The real question here is how often will the benefits outweigh the cost of expending that hit die, because that means you have less recovery later. So you're trading more power now for less recovery later. Will the juice always be worth the squeeze? So that's going to be something that's very interesting. I do like this feature a lot. I do feel like it came out of left field a little bit. I didn't expect like a hit die based feature to exist here, but I'm certainly not opposed to it. I just think it's going to ride or die on how good the other psionic die using features are. So after level 7, we jump all the way to level 19 where they get their epic boon. And of course, this is standard for 2024. And it's not necessarily that they don't get any features between level 7 and 19. It's just that the only new features that they get from their base class are going to be their additional psionic disciplines at level 10 and 17. And then of course, there's like your additional subclass features and your feats that you get at those levels, but these kinds of gaps do make these class feel a little empty. I do know that there's a feature at 10 and 17, but that's just an expansion of an existing feature. I think there's room to put at least one more feature in there, maybe something again that makes their psionic energy die a little bit more efficient, but we'll see. And then finally, their capstone is something called Enkindled Life Force. It says once per turn, when you expend one psionic energy die and roll it for a psion feature or psionic discipline, you can expend 2 of your hit point die and roll 2 additional psionic energy die and add the numbers rolled to the total. So again, we're seeing an alternate use of our hit point dice, which is really interesting. So basically you're sacrificing 2 times 1d6 plus your constitution modifier for adding 2d12 to a roll, which is a pretty significant bonus for relatively little cost at this level, because again, your psionic energy die are d12s by level 20. So much like Psionic Surge, this is going to live and die by how good the psionic die effects are. If the idea of sacrificing 14 hit points later on as a recovery is worth the benefit that you get from using one or both of these features. So on that note, we are going to start looking into the actual psionic discipline options. These are going to be all the different options that we can choose at levels 2, 10, and 17. Again, we get a total of 6 of them throughout our career, 2 at each of those points. These are going to be the things that we use to expend our psionic energy dice. So part of what we're going to be doing as we look at them is looking at how good of a use of Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force that they are. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the first psionic discipline option called Biofeedback. It says when you cast a psion spell from the Necromancy or Transmutation School, you can expend 1 psionic energy die and roll it. You gain a number of temporary hit points equal to the number rolled plus your intelligence modifier minimum of 1. So psions don't have access to many Necromancy spells, but the transmutation is relatively common. As written, this does work on cantrips, so you could use this outside of combat with like a mending or message cantrip and buff your hit points in that way. I think that this would be a bad use of Psionic Surge because it's basically just going to give you up to 3 more temporary hit points at the cost of recovering, 1d6 plus your constitution modifier later. It might be an okay use of Enkindled Life Force because again, your psionic energy die are d12s by that time. 2 hit die worth of recovery is going to be about 11 to 13 hit points on average, depending on what your con modifier is. For an average increase of 13 temporary hit points, which is what the 2d12 would give you on average. So if your con mod is 2 or less, you can actually roll below average on the 2d12 and still sort of break even. And the 2d12 also has a higher ceiling, so you can possibly high roll on those and get more effective health health out of it than you would through the recovery during a short rest. The next discipline option is called Destructive Thoughts. It says when you cast a Psion spell from your Conjuration or Evocation school and a creature you can see succeeds a saving throw against a spell, you can expend 1 Psionic energy die and roll it. This creature takes psychic damage equal to the number rolled plus your intelligence modifier minimum of 1. If a creature saves against one of these types of spells, they take some psychic damage. I will say that Psions don't have many Conjuration or Evocation spells. They do have some, and again, this technically does work on cantrips as well, although not all of your cantrips are saving throw based, but the vast majority of their leveled spells are saving throw based. I would say generally speaking, this is probably a bad use of Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force, with the one caveat being if you know that it will help drop an enemy to 0 before that enemy's next turn. If you can help drop an enemy to 0 to prevent them from taking their next turn, then you are preventing the damage that they would have done during that next turn during that round. It might not prevent you specifically from taking any extra damage, but it will prevent your party members from possibly taking some extra damage as well. If we're going to be using it for that reason, I do think that Enkindled Life Force will be better at doing that. Adding 1 to 3 more damage on an attack really isn't usually going to make a big difference, whereas adding an additional 2d12 could make that difference. Another exception to this would also be if you know you're going to be attacking something with psychic resistance, that you'd want to burn that hit die through the Psionic Surge to restore your use of the attack mode. That way you can ignore their Psionic resistance, which again helps you deal more damage, which helps you drop more creatures to 0 more quickly, and helps reduce incoming damage to the party that way. The next discipline option is called Devilish Tongue. It says when you make an influence action, you can expend 1 Psionic energy die, roll it, and add the number rolled to the ability check. This is pretty decent. I think as far as Psionic Surge and Enkindled Life Force go, it's kind of indeterminable how useful this can be. Not all influence actions are high stakes. Not all stakes are damage based. Is this influence action, helping bypass a combat? Is it convincing an otherwise indifferent NPC to your cause? There are certain instances where making a very important, persuasion check or deception check can actually be very, very advantageous to your party if you know for sure that it will cause you to succeed. Where I just think Enkindled Life Force can help give you that huge burst of 2d12 that's basically like a super Bardic Inspiration, and it stacks with Bardic Inspiration and Guidance and all those other things. That can certainly be a great use of those features. I'm probably not going to be using it to bargain for better prices at a shop, but I think there are plenty of situations where there are high stakes influence actions that can happen. The next discipline option is Ego Whip. It says whenever a creature provokes an opportunity attack from you by leaving your reach, you can take a reaction to roll 1 Psionic energy die and force a creature to make an intelligence saving throw. On a failed save, the target's speed is reduced by 10 feet, and it subtracts the number rolled from the next damage roll it makes before the end of its next turn. The die is expended only if the target fails the saving throw. So you're expending the energy die, they make a saving throw. If they fail it, their speed is reduced by 10 feet, and the next damage they deal on their next turn is also reduced by an amount equal to that roll. I would say this is probably a bad use of Psionic Surge. It is just the next one instance of damage. It is not going to be from every attack on their turn. So lowering the next instance of damage by just 3 doesn't really seem worth it to me. I think this could be an okay to good use of Enkindled Life Force because the 2d12 will matter much more than the 1 to 3 that the Psionic Surge would give you. That's basically allowing you to roll 3d12 is pretty significant, and it'd be even more significant if it's on like an AoE effect. If a bunch of people are hit by that AoE, they are all benefiting from that damage reduction. So there's definitely some high rolling that can happen there. The next one is called Expanded Awareness. It says when you take the search action, you can expend 1 Psionic energy die, roll it, and add the number to an ability check. Very similar to the one for the influence action. I would say probably a bad use of Psionic Surge and Enkindled Life Force. Usually these things aren't going to be life or death. If it comes up, then you can certainly use those features, but I couldn't see myself burning a hit die for this in the vast majority of situations. The next one is called Id Insinuation. It says when you cast a Psion spell from the enchantment or illusion school that forces a creature to make a saving throw, you can expend 2 Psionic energy die to roll 1. So you expend 2 but roll 1. One target of the spell you can see subtracts the number rolled from its saving throw against the spell. So enchantment and illusion spells are among the more common Psionic spell types. However, several of the illusion spells don't require saving throws, but most of the enchantment ones do. I would say this is a good use of Psionic Surge. Again, being able to penalize saving throws is usually very good, especially if you've determined that the enemy has a weak bonus to that save type. And I don't believe that this actually works with Enkindled Life Force because that feature says when you expend 1 Psionic energy die and this feature expends 2. So I believe that wording is there specifically to exclude this from working with the Psion capstone. And that's basically because if you could use Enkindled Life Force with this feature, you could basically cause creatures to auto-fail your saving throws by penalizing their saving throw by 3d12. Basically all but the highest CR monsters are going to automatically fail if you're rolling 3d12 to penalize their saving throw. The next one is called Inerrant Aim. This says when you make an attack roll against a creature and miss, you can roll 1 Psionic energy die and add the number rolled to the attack roll, potentially turning a miss into a hit. If this causes the attack to hit, the die is expended. So there's a little more efficiency there as well. I would say this is an okay use of Psionic Surge and Enkindled Life Force. The downside is that the only Psion spells with attack rolls within the base class, at least, are their cantrips. So similar to the Destructive Thoughts, I would say whether or not this is going to be a good use of Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force is if you know hitting with that attack is going to cause that creature to drop to 0 before their next turn. Or, of course, if it's a particularly powerful attack that you're trying to make, then of course you'd want to make sure that it hits. So I probably wouldn't use it all the time, but again, in those situations, I would certainly make that consideration. The next feature is called Psionic Backlash. It says immediately after a creature you can see hits you with an attack roll, you can take a reaction to expend 1 Psionic Energy die, roll 2 Psionic Energy die, and subtract the number rolled on each die from the total. In addition, you can force the attacker to make a Wisdom saving throw. On a failed save, the target takes psychic damage equal to the amount rolled on the 2 Psionic Energy dice. So this is basically their version of the shield spell. You know, spoiler alert, Psions don't get the shield spell in their spell list, which is a little unfortunate. That does make this feature feel kind of a little mandatory in order to protect yourself if you know that you're going to get attacked. I do feel like they should have both options if they really want to, though this would be a good use of Psionic Surge, assuming that you know that you could turn that hit into a miss. Not all DMs are transparent with their hit totals, so sometimes you kind of have to guess. I think this is a great use of Enkindled Life Force. I'm not 100% certain that it works with it because Enkindled Life Force says whenever you roll 1 Psionic Energy die and roll it, you can expend 2 hit die to roll 2 additional Psionic Energy die, whereas this one expends 1, but it rolls 2, so I don't know if that's also excluded. You're still expending 1 die and rolling it, you're just rolling an additional 1 as well, so I'm not quite sure how that works out. If it does work with Enkindled Life Force, then I think this is of course a great use of it because you can basically guarantee that an attack misses by rolling essentially 4 Psionic Energy die and subtracting that from their total. For that reason, I think it might not work with Enkindled Life Force, but it's not super clear. They probably need to make the wording on Enkindled Life Force a little bit clearer, where it might say something like when you expend and roll only 1 Psionic Energy die rather than when you expend 1 energy die and roll it. So if it does work with Enkindled Life Force, this is great because you can basically make anything other than a critical hit miss. If it doesn't work with Enkindled Life Force, then it's, moot anyway. And if it doesn't work with Enkindled Life Force, then I definitely think that they should have access to the shield spell. The next discipline option is called Psionic Guards. It says at the start of your turn, you can expend 1 Psionic Energy die. Until the start of your next turn, you have immunity to the Charmed and Frightened conditions and advantage on intelligence saving throws. If you are charmed or frightened when you use this discipline, the condition ends on you. It is not suppressed, it is ended. When you use Psionic Guards, you can also use a different Psionic discipline this turn. When I read this one, I thought this one was pretty powerful, so for that reason, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some disciplines get a level requirement when they eventually publish the Psion. Again, you get your first Psionic disciplines at level 2, and this feels like a pretty powerful feature for a level 2 player. Even if it had a prerequisite of level 7, you do have the ability to change your disciplines out on when you level up, so you could pick this up when you get that level anyway. And this one has no interaction with Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force because you are not rolling any dice as part of this feature. The next one is called Swift Precognition. It says when you cast a Psion spell from the Abjuration or Divination School with a casting time of an action, you can spend a number of Psionic Energy die to change the casting time to a bonus action for this casting. The number of dice equals 1 plus the spell's level. So this is basically the quicken spell sort of version. I will say most divination spells are not combat oriented, so moving them to a bonus action is kind of irrelevant. There might not also be a lot of cases where you'd want to quicken an abjuration spell either. You can probably come up with some scenarios, but I don't see this happening so often, and especially because the cost to do this is pretty high. Because again, remember, we only have a number of dice equal to like twice our proficiency bonus. So if we're using this on like a 3rd level spell, which is when the good abjuration spells start to come online for the Psion, that is going to be 4 of your Psionic Energy die, which is pretty crazy. So that feels like a pretty heavy cost. And again, because we're not rolling any Psionic Energy die, this does not interact with Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force. The next one here is called Tactical Mind. This is the last discipline option available in the Unearthed Arcana. It says when you take the study action, you can expend 1 Psionic Energy die and roll it and add the number rolled to the ability check. I will say they probably need to rename this feature because that is the same name as the level 2 fighter feature. And I would say this is probably a bad use of Psionic Surge or Enkindled Life Force because again, most study actions are not going to be life or death. Maybe if you need to get yourself out of a maze spell, which requires like an intelligence investigation check. But again, most of the time study actions aren't very high stakes. So those are all the discipline options. I think most of them are fine. I think there's a lot of room for expansion upon them when they release other supplemental materials with maybe more Psion subclasses. They can release more discipline options as well. I think there's a lot of room for growth there. I think there's even some ideas that they could put in even with the release of the Psion. But let's go and take a look at the Psionic spell list. We're going to go past this one pretty quick, but we'll take a quick look. So you can pause to read if you want to. We got our cantrips and our 1st level spells. We see that they have a new cantrip called Telekinetic Fling. We'll take a look at that pretty soon here. The C's in the column mean that it's a concentration spell. spell, of course. R means it's a ritual. And then M means that it has a costly or consumed component, so that the Psion would need to have the component for that casting. One trend that we'll notice is that outside of the cantrips, there aren't any leveled spells that require an attack roll, which is kind of weird / unfortunate. There's no like Chromatic Orb, which admittedly doesn't really fit the Psion, but even something like a Witch Bolt or something along those lines. Also, we'll see that they're revising some spells that weren't in the player's handbook for the Psion. And I think one spell that isn't here that could be is the Catapult spell. I think that fits the Psion perfectly. It might already be in Eberron. I don't know with the Artificer, but I think it also should be on the Psion spell list. Then moving on again to the level 2 and level 3 Psion spells, we see the return of Tasha's Mind Whip in the second level spells. And then of course, Intellect Fortress is returning in the third level spells. And then we have 2 new Psion spells in the third level spells. One is called Summon Astral Entity and the other is called Telekinetic Crush. And again, we'll look at those in a second. I will say that Animate Dead here feels a little weird. I'm not sure what that has to do with the Psion. I don't know if there's any lore behind that. If one of you watching knows, please let me know in the comments. I'd be interested in that one. That was the first thing that kind of confused me, other than the lack of the shield spell and the level 1 spells. I also think a spell that isn't here that could be is the Shadow Blade spell, because that literally does psychic damage. I think that could easily be on the Psion spell list. For the 4th and 5th level spells, we have the return of Ralathim's Psychic Lance. Other than that, there's nothing really too much to talk about here. And then finally, the 6th through 9th level spells. The only thing that's returning here is the Psychic Scream spell and the 9th level spells. Otherwise, I mean, their spell list is, perfectly serviceable. I do think that the lack of attack spells, or even a lot of blaster spells, I think is pretty interesting. It kind of pins the Psion into being much more of a utility or control caster. There are plenty of spells that do deal damage that you could be a blaster if you want to. But basically, if you're going to build a Psion blaster, you're basically going to be using the same spells every time, because you don't have much variety in the way of those. And then again, at the beginning of this video, when I was talking about what do I think that a Psion spellcaster would look like, I said that they would probably not have many evocation or necromancy spells. And that's pretty much how it panned out. Again, they don't have many evocation spells. We see Blade Barrier here. Force Cage, of course, makes a lot of sense as well. They do have a couple of evocation cantrips, but again, those also make sense. Eye Bite makes sense. Astral Projection, of course, feels very Psion themed as well. The only one that really didn't make sense to me in Necromancy was Animate Dead. But that is their spell list. Let's go and move on to the actual changes to spells in this Unearthed Arcana. So starting with Intellect Fortress, we can see that the only change here is that when you upcast it, originally the additional targets needed to be within 30 feet of your initial target. That text has been removed, so it just needs to be within range of the spell. Then moving on to Psychic Scream. It now says that if the target is reduced to 0 hit points, its head explodes, whereas currently it says if the target is killed by the spell, its head explodes. So this basically means that if a DM is causing a creature to make death saves, that this creature would instead just automatically die, presuming that it can't exist without a head. Additionally, it also states that the stunned target repeats the saving throw rather than making an intelligence saving throw. I can't think of a scenario where this makes a difference, where in the current wording of it, it's like it's making 2 different intelligence saving throws, but now it's the exact same one because you're repeating the initial save. Again, I don't think that makes a difference, but if there was a situation where that would come up, that is maybe something that is now closed according to this description. Moving on then to Ralathim's Psychic Lance. This one adds additional context as to what constitutes a creature's name, and that the spell is lost if you use an invalid name. So it says that pseudonyms, titles, or nicknames do not work. You do need to know the actual name of that creature. This would be particularly important for creatures like devils and other fiends that have true names that you're not supposed to know. And there's like a specific books that have the list of names of all these demons that you could find. That's basically a whole adventure in itself. Next, we're going to look at one of the new spells, Summon Astral Entity. We can see that it's also available to the Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. I think that's pretty exciting. This is pretty standard fare for all the other summon spells. Again, it comes with different modes, Crystal, Ectoplasmic, and Ghostly, and it follows all the same rules as the other summon spells. It shares your initiative count, it obeys your commands, it doesn't require an action to command them to do something. So then looking at the actual stat block, we have the Psionic Spirit. We can see that for the Crystal Entity, it gets a +2 to their armor class. The Ghostly Entity gets an additional 30-foot fly speed. I think it's a little odd that they don't have hover. They have immunity to psychic damage. The Ectoplasmic and Ghostly entities also get incorporeal passage. Each of them have their own kind of attack. The Crystal entity gets a melee attack, the Ghostly entity gets a ranged attack, and the Ectoplasmic entity gets a ranged attack that, whether it hits or misses, also causes creatures to have their speed slowed by 5 feet within 5 feet of that target, including the original target. So that's pretty cool as well. And then lastly, the Crystal entity has a special reaction that is basically like an uncanny dodge combined with a Misty Step. So pretty cool summon there. I like that one a lot. Then let's go and move on to look at Tasha's Mind Whip. So Tasha's Mind Whip has had its duration changed from 1 round to instantaneous. The only possible impact I could think of here is that this means that the effect can't be dispelled. The lingering effect of Tasha's Mind Whip can't be dispelled. This also now says that the target can't make opportunity attacks, whereas previously this said that the creature can't take reactions until the end of its next turn. This is basically the same change that we saw to Shocking Grasp, so there's no real surprise there. You know, it is certainly sad to see it go, but there's no way that we're going to change their mind to change that back to reaction. Additionally, it now says that it can either take an action or a bonus action on its next turn, but not both. Currently, this says that they can either choose to move, take an action, or a bonus action, not all three. So I know that this spell is something that I've seen a number of DMs complaining about. Only a second level spell. If you're at higher levels and you're just spamming this on like your big bad evil guy, they have to basically burn their legendary resistance in order to do something on their turn, unless they want to stand still and take an action. But if everyone's so far away that they can't, then you kind of got. And so I can certainly understand why they removed the movement from the limitations here. So then the next spell we're going to look at is called Telekinetic Crush. This is a new one. It is available to the Scion, of course, and the Sorcerer and the Warlock. It is an action, 120 foot range, verbal component only, which means that the Scion can cast it with no components. It says you create a field of crushing telekinetic force in a 30-foot cube within range. Each creature in the area makes a strength saving throw, and on a failed save, the target takes 5d6 force damage and has the prone condition. On a successful save, a target takes half as much damage only. And then when you cast this using a higher level spell slot, it deals an additional 1d6 damage per spell level above 3. So basically, this is just a slightly smaller fireball that does a little bit less damage. However, it also has a much more reliable damage type in the fact that it deals force damage, and then it also has the benefit of causing enemies to fall prone. So that's certainly a pretty good spell. Again, fireball is sort of intentionally overtuned, so this is maybe a more balanced version of that. The fact that it knocks creatures prone is actually pretty cool. And again, this is completely free for the Scion. It only has a verbal component, and Scions can ignore verbal components. So basically, if they cast this spell, it cannot be counterspelled. So then finally, moving on to the last spell, we have Telekinetic Fling. This is the Scion cantrip. It is exclusive to Scions. It has a 60-foot range, which is a little short, but it's also mostly in line with the other cantrips, the other offensive cantrips that the Scion has, so that's cool. It does require a form of ammunition, which is interesting. That is the material component. Technically, this would require your free object interaction every turn you cast this spell to take out the ammunition and, throw it as part of the spell. The ability to draw your ammunition as part of the attack is only part of the ammunition property on weapons. It is not part of the description of ammunition specifically. Again, I'm sure that we'll ignore this rule, so that all that is irrelevant anyway. It also states that the ammunition is destroyed on hit, which means that you cannot recover your ammunition. You need to have enough to keep casting this cantrip over and over again, which is really strange as well. And again, the ability to recover half of your ammunition is part of the ammunition property on weapons. It is not an inherent property of ammunition either. This does do 1d10 force damage on a hit, which is pretty good. It deals an additional d10 at higher levels at 5, 11, and 17, so that's cool. The only thing I don't like about this is the material component. I do like the sort of flavor of literal mind bullets. The reliance on ammunition is a strange component, especially since Scions have access to True Strike. They can just use that with a light crossbow or whatever, and they never have to worry about any of this ammunition junk if their DM is enforcing it. So finally, let's get to my initial impressions. I would say, without having looked at the subclasses yet, I think the base class is mostly fine. I know a lot of people are kind of up in arms about a bunch of different things, but honestly, this is a very playable class that they're presenting. My only complaints and suggestions would be that the level 1 telepathic connection psionic power, again, that the psionic die increase the distance of your telepathy beyond 5 feet for a number of minutes equal to your psion level. It's very convoluted, feels very underwhelming even for a level 1 feature. For the psionic modes, I think the psionic resistance interactions are too specific for a base class feature. The base class features I feel like should just generally be more universal, so that whenever you play that class in any setting, that all their features, their base class features, work within that setting. I think subclasses are where you can get more specific, not base classes. I would also prefer it to just not be a reflavored innate sorcery. I would probably ask to consider a feature that restores psionic energy die more often. I think testing would be needed to actually feel if you have enough for every adventuring day to use all the things that you want to use without running out of them too soon. I would like to see the Shield, Catapult, and Shadow Blade spells added to the spell list at least. So notice that Psions seem to have a lot of concentration spells and they have no way to protect their concentration. And so I think that they could build something in possibly as a Psionic Discipline to like expend a use of your Psionic Energy die to boost your Constitution saves in order to maintain concentration by that much. And again, like I just mentioned, I think they should reconsider the material component on Telekinetic Fling. I think it'd be cleaner just to make it a Psychic ammunitions, similar to the Soul Knife Rogue's Psychic blades that aren't an actual blade. But that is the Psion base class. That is how it works. That is sort of my initial overview of it. Again, I think it's mostly fine. I'm not like super hyped about it or anything along those lines. I think there's a lot of cool things to work with. I do like the inclusion of hit die as an alternate resource. That would be very fun to play with. But let me know what you think. Are there any sort of particular things that you think stand out? What are your favorite things about it? What are your least favorite things about it? Let me know all that and more down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time and I'll see you in the next one.